Hi, I'm Randy Mastro, Chair of Citizens Union, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to Spring for Reform. This is a particularly consequential year in New York City politics, perhaps the most consequential mayoral election in decades, and we have ranked choice voting for the first time. So much to discuss here tonight from a very distinguished group of journalists who will be joining us. I'm not sure whether this is more like an appearance on New York One or MSNBC, but I'm very grateful to this distinguished group of journalists who will be joining us to talk about the race. Special thanks to CU staff, Betsy Gottbaum, our great executive director, and all of you for contributing to the important work of Citizens Union. This particular cycle, with so many city races, including the highest office there is in our city, is what we thrive and live for, to help voters understand these elections and the issues and the candidates. So thank you all for being a part of this, contributing to this. Special thanks to Standard Industries for sponsoring this event. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, a rising star in New York City politics, our new Congressman, Ritchie Torres.
Good evening, I'm Congressman Ritchie Torres, and I have the high honor of representing New York 15, the South Bronx, which has been shown to be the essential congressional district of America. The South Bronx is home to essential workers who put their lives at risk on the front lines during the peak of the pandemic so that the rest of the city could safely shelter in place. I hope the future mayor, whomever he or she may be, will recognize that we as a city are judged by how we honor, in both word and deed, the most essential among us. Even though we were hit the earliest and hardest by COVID-19, the greatness of New York City lives on. New York is the city with the deepest density and diversity of people and talent. New York is a microcosm of the world where 200 languages are spoken and where immigrants from every corner of the earth come in search of a new life. New York is home to titans in finance and housing, healthcare and higher education, media and technology. New York is truly the post-COVID, can-do, comeback city. A city is only as great as the institutions and individuals that sustain it. Great institutions like Citizens Union, great individuals like Errol Louis and Mara Gay. All of you are the guardians of our local democracy. Your commitment to holding government accountable comes from a passion for New York City, a core conviction that the city you love needs and deserves political leaders who are worthy of its greatness. The greatest challenge confronting New York City is not only COVID-19 and the legacy it leaves behind. The greatest challenge is a crisis of leadership at the very moment when we need it the most. The race for mayor is thus the most consequential of our lifetime. And although local in scope, the election of the next mayor will have national import. In paying tribute to American federalism, Justice Louis Brandeis once spoke of states as well as localities as the laboratories of democracy. But not all laboratories are created equal. New York City is the greatest among them. New York City is home to a municipal workforce of more than 300,000. It possesses the largest public school system and the largest police force, the largest public housing and public hospital systems, the largest network of parks and public libraries. Whoever has the high honor of leading democracy's greatest laboratory will unquestionably have an outsized impact on politics and public policy in the United States. As New York City goes, so goes the rest of America. Although I have long been a critic of the incumbent mayor, one must give credit where credit is due. He entered office with a clear vision of pre-K for all. He secured hundreds of millions of dollars in state funding from Albany. And his administration implemented with astonishing speed the largest UPK program in the United States. The success story of UPK, both the vision and the execution, is a particularly powerful demonstration of what can be achieved when the sheer power of New York City government with its massive machinery is harnessed for big and bold governing. The next mayor must recognize that no place on earth has a wider realm of political possibility, lends itself more powerfully to transformational leadership than the city of New York. My advice to the next mayor of New York is quite simple. Be the pothole mayor with your feet firmly planted on the ground, but also be as big and as bold as our recovery and racial reckoning require. And always be worthy of New York City's greatness. New Yorkers deserve no less, and Citizens Union, Errol Louis, and Mara Gay will demand no less. Enjoy the evening.
Hi, I'm Ben Smith. I'm a media columnist for the New York Times, really basically a New York City political blogger at heart. And am thrilled to be joined for this Citizens Union panel by, I think, vastly the two most powerful people in New York political media. Mara Gay is on the New York Times editorial board and is, I think, the sort of central voice there on New York City affairs, was a great City Hall reporter before that for the Wall Street Journal. And is essentially, I always think of her as sort of the media mayor of New York in this extremely powerful job at the Times edit board. And I'm surprised nobody's written a profile of her and written this story, and I can't because I'm at the Times. And as well, and Errol Louis is the host of Inside City Hall New York One, is I think the dominant television interviewer in New York politics for a long time. Has also had a radio show, has a column in the Daily News, has run for office himself, is generally the sort of, master of all New York political media. I think also can be found on CNN. So anyway, very privileged and lucky to have the two of you here. We all are. And in this incredibly interesting, strange, fun last days of a mayoral race. And so, I guess I think just to start with a broad question, Mara, what are you watching for in these last few weeks?
So this may sound anecdotal, but as someone who's covered quite a few races from the news side and now the opinion side, it's all about how it feels on the ground. I think GOTV is going to probably play a pretty crucial role here. So I noticed this morning I saw quite a few Garcia signs in my neighborhood, and kind of want to know who's at the subway stations, the perils of Zoom, right? You want to know who's at the subway station, who's at the farmer's market, who's really sending volunteers to knock on doors. And I think in such a low turnout or potentially low turnout primary with so many unknowns, getting out the vote, GOTV, that kind of canvassing and ground campaign can really make the difference in any neighborhood, in any number of scenarios. So that's, how does it feel? How many signs are you seeing? What are people?
For disclosure, what neighborhood are you in that you're seeing all the Garcias?
I can't really. I don't want to say for
what borough.
I'm in Brooklyn.
All right.
I'm in Brownstone, Brooklyn.
Yeah. We may over-index. We may over-index certain Brooklyn neighborhoods here.
For sure.
Well, what do you see in Errol?
Well, first of all, Mara is exactly right. There's this surge on the streets that happens in the closing days of a campaign. And that was how, back in 2013, we realized that Bill de Blasio wasn't just doing okay, but that he was surging. There was a phenomenon that the reporters were bringing back to us saying that people were waiting in line, not so much to talk to de Blasio, but to ask about his son. And that reflected the campaign commercial that won an award and arguably won the election for him with his son Dante. And that told us something. That did tell us something. And political pros will tell you the size of the crowds, the intensity. You catch these little flashes here and there. One bit that I saw myself just a few weeks ago, I happened to be up in Harlem when Ray McGuire was opening his Harlem office, and people were lining up And it wasn't just to shake his hand, they wanted his autograph, which really sort of said something to me, that for that crowd on that day at least, he had kind of moved into a different category, into sort of semi-celebrity status, which I guess is what happens when you run millions of dollars worth of ads on television. So I'll certainly be watching for that. I am curious about the hard mechanics of the race, though. Most of the people I've talked to inside and outside of the actual campaigns think that the turnout is going to be something around 800,000 to 820, maybe 830,000 votes cast, meaning each candidate that wants to win is trying their best to get 400,000 votes, as many of them as possible as either a first choice or maybe a second choice. And that is just a hard mechanical grind of trying to figure out who might want to be in your camp and calling them up and then calling them again and then calling them again and trying to intercept them in as many ways as possible on social media, through television, the follow-up phone calls, asking them to commit, and on and on and on. And so we'll see who's able to do it. And then I guess finally, you can gauge who's doing well by who is attacking them. So when somebody is suddenly getting a whole lot of attacks, you can be pretty sure that person is perceived, at least by the other candidates, as doing well. And that's an important data point as well.
And sorry about the background noise. It's some dogs, and parenting, and all the usual things. Takeout. One of the things that you see in the polls right now, Mara, is that essentially, I don't know what centrist, non-progressive candidates are winning. Like you add up Andrew Yang and Eric Adams, you're starting to get up near 50%. After this last year's focus on reforming the police, this election, you have a series of candidates essentially in a very kind of old-fashioned way demanding more policing and treating the rise in gun crime as the central campaign issue. How do you interpret that?
I think it's far too early to tell whether the appetite for NYPD reform has diminished. I think it's clear that the appetite for competence in government is pretty fierce. And this also might be a reflection about the fact that the differences policy-wise between the candidates in this race are so much smaller than the kind of policy differences that you see at the national level between Republicans and Democrats. So someone like Catherine Garcia, for example, who, full disclosure, the New York Times has endorsed, right? She may not have the language that Dianne Morales has to talk about progressive issues, or Maya Wylde has to talk about progressive issues. But when you get down to what they actually talk about wanting to do in office and who they would try and serve, there's a lot of overlap there. And I think that New Yorkers kind of understand that intuitively. This is a Democratic primary in a city that has moved increasingly left. So they're looking for something more than policy, is what I would say. They're choosing a person, not a platform.
Do you agree with that, Errol?
Oh, absolutely. Scott Stringer, who for many different reasons we can get into or just ignore, has been struggling lately. But his campaign slogan, I think, did accurately try and capture an important sense of the mood of the city, where he was saying a progressive candidate who's ready on day one, trying to sort of merge both the political urge toward reform and toward progressive policies with this absolute hunger for well-run government. And we did a poll at New York One with Ipsos, and one of the things we found, this was a couple of months ago, and I have no reason to think that this has changed in the slightest, people very highly valued government experience. People very highly valued management experience, management chops, if you want to call it that. And I think that's what happens when 33,000 people die in a single year, mostly in the space of a couple of months in the city, in part because of the management of the coronavirus pandemic was not really handled as well as perhaps it might have, depending on what week you're talking about. And so I think people understand exactly what's at stake when you have management of government that is not working very well. That was seen both at the city and the state level, but even more so at the federal level. and the disastrous White House response that arguably cost Donald Trump his job. So I think that is going to be a predominant theme. And then, when you merge that with the reality that there's been a really sharp increase in shootings and in homicides, some of them heartbreaking. You want to tear your teeth out when you read about a 12-year-old being shot and killed, a 10-year-old being shot and killed, a 3-year-old being shot in the middle of Times Square. I mean, people, I think, are going to rightfully say, this is the bottom line. You've got to get this right. If you can't get that right, if you can't get safety on the streets right, if you can't get the pandemic right, we have no use for you down at City Hall.
Do you find it disappointing? Should people be disappointed that after this sort of last summer's sense that it was sort of a movement year at a moment, in American history when there is all this, in a lot of different axes, potential for change, that we're that we're looking for like a kind of competent mayor who will pick up garbage. Like it just seems pretty uninspiring.
As a person who often welcomes social change, but also values having the garbage picked up, I don't know if they're necessarily incompatible. I also would say, since you're bringing up history, people should be aware that potent social movements almost always, it's almost like a law of politics, give rise to an equally potent counter movement. And that is what we are starting to see. So, yes, when record numbers of people go out into the street chanting Black Lives Matter, the bookend to that, or the response to that in part, was the insurrection on January 6th. I mean, that's where we are. And so folks, if they're serious about social change, need to take the long view, figure out where they're going to be as the inevitable counter reaction. And that's voter suppression, that's voter nullification, that's harsh attacks, blind, harsh, and ahistorical attacks on what's being called critical race theory, which has nothing to do with actual critical race theory. That's what you get when you have a successful social movement. It's kind of a social movement equivalent of what I was saying before. You're succeeding when you start to draw enemies.
I just noticed that when you say critical race theory, it activates Siri. So, I'm going to have to tell Congress about that. Mara, on the other end, but I think there's a lot of other kinds of change happening right now. Deep technological change in thinking about how cities ought to be organized and function, particularly, I guess, in terms of housing. And I'm curious if you think the Times' candidate, Catherine Garcia, or any of these others, if it's a moment when New York City can be remade, in terms of, there was this, visualization of a city that they were floating around of us. I think that the Times did, of a city, with bike lanes and tons of new housing and things like that. Or are we just, like, in the best case, going to keep crime down and pick up the garbage?
No, I guess I'm an optimist. I do think that this is a moment. Gosh, after more than 30,000 people died, thousands more got sick, millions lost their jobs, their livelihood, if only temporarily. If we're not going to make some changes that improve life here now, then we're just not going to get it done. So we really do need to marshal the political energy and courage to make the changes that we want. And I think the streetscape is a good example of that. And that doesn't have to be crunchy Park Slope. That can be, hey, I want to see fewer people get killed by cars on city streets. That can be, let's reduce emissions near the Cross Bronx Expressway so that asthma rates are lower in impoverished areas of the city. So there's a huge opportunity here. I know too that I think back, Errol was talking about the history of social movements and backlash. I totally agree with you, Errol. I also think that there's another phenomenon here at stake, which is, look, social movements, protest movements have a purpose, and that purpose and that role is very different than, political office holders. So, Lyndon Johnson, who no one, I think, would accuse of being a socialist or, a radical, oversaw some of the most enormous changes in our society. And that was because that social movements pushed him there. And I think there's an opportunity for us in New York to do that here as well. I mean, again, you think about some of the moderate candidates in this race. I'm not convinced that we need to throw in the towel on police reform whatsoever. I just think, also separately, I know you're asking about housing, but just to kind of touch on this a little bit more, to dive deeper, there's this false equivalence, this narrative that we have to balance reform of the police with safety. And I would actually argue that it's really ridiculous, because when you look at it, if you have a police force that is more professional and accountable to the public it serves and to the elected officials it works for as well, to the extent that police reduce crime at all, you're going to actually kill two birds with one stone. And I think that is something that we really need to understand. Really good example of that was, we saw last week, there was a report about during the protests last summer, how the police managed to inflict, I saw personally, they were beating protesters, peaceful protesters in the street. And yet on the other side of town, they weren't responding right away to riots and looting. And so that's a really good example of how reform can actually also make a better police force. So, I think mayors can be pushed to do a lot of things, from housing to policing, and yet you have to push them there. That's part of our job.
This being Citizens Union, we have an audience question about whether public sector worker unions have too much power. Maybe not being Citizens Union, it's a good question. And I think the police union is is this particular example that has come under enormous fire for, really just doing a lot of work to protect bad cops, particularly, and being this incredibly divisive public force in the city as well. And I guess I wonder, are they the exception or are they the rule? Do public sector unions have too much power in general? Did the teachers union, I guess in particular, play a positive or negative role in COVID? And how should the next mayor look at that, Errol?
I think of these as questions that have to be answered by looking at the individuals, the elected officials, because let's keep in mind, you are elected the head of the PBA or Local 237 of the Teamsters or the United Federation of Teachers. In fact, the UFT is an interesting one, in part because they allow full voting rights to their retirees, who vastly outnumber the actual working teachers. So it's very, I've often gotten the impression that there are some 60s generation radicals who are retired in Florida who are saying, fight on, press on, go after those charter schools, in ways that have really nothing to do with the situation on the ground here at times. I'll hear from some of them for saying that, but it's true. I don't think so. Look, I think it depends on where the individual leaders want to take their unions. I've talked with many of them many times. I have a lot of respect for Pat Lynch. I keep thinking one day I'm going to wake up and he'll realize that he could be so much more than just an angry guy railing against the general direction of politics in New York.
Don't you think, he's, as you said, he's an elected official. Don't you think he's just representing the angry, alienated views of his constituents who are cops? Isn't that a little scary?
Well, what's interesting is you'd never know whenever he does those archetypal press conferences where he's surrounded by a bunch of angry white guys, you'd never know that something like 40% of his membership are people of color. He's staked out a direction and a style. And you have to assume that, workers are electing the representatives who are saying what they want to be said. But I know enough about the police department, because half my family was part of it, that I know he could have chosen a different course. Just like any politician, you can build different kinds of coalitions. You can evolve the direction in which you want to take. That's called leadership. You can bring people to a place where maybe they're not entirely comfortable at first and do it for some larger good. You can do all of those things. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that from Pat Lynch. As for the other union leaders, I think they're all playing according to type. They're getting the best deals that they can for their membership. We should keep in mind that the prior mayor, Mike Bloomberg, let every single union contract lapse in this city, which was like a decade of hardship for tens of thousands of families. And so they're absolutely right to make sure that that never happens again, to be involved in these races. We should keep in mind that depending on which union you're talking about, they are in fact New Yorkers. If they choose to organize in that particular way according to their workplace, as opposed to by block association or by borough or by some other kind of affinity, that's entirely okay. I don't think any one of them will predominate over all the other many factors that go into picking a mayor. But no, so I guess I'd say I don't think that they have too much influence. I think sometimes their influence is not what we would have it be, and I would say that to Pat Lynch any day of the week. It's like, I don't question or begrudge you your power, but I sure wish you would use it in a different direction.
Anything on that, Mara?
No, I think Errol, you summed it up perfectly.
As usual. So I think we're running out of time here. So last question for each of you: is there a down ballot race, a non-mayoral race that or candidate that you just think is particularly interesting and worth watching, whether it's someone you've endorsed and are supporting, or just something people should pay attention to?
Yeah, we've endorsed Alvin Bragg for DA in Manhattan, and while there's a lot of talent in that race, no doubt. So I don't have anything bad to say about any of the other candidates. This is a really exciting opportunity to have somebody who is, I would say, exceptionally qualified and talented, and well positioned for this moment. A lot of experience, but who also has life experience, as an African American man who's from Harlem. And we could have the first Black DA in Manhattan. He's got an uphill battle against, Tally Weinstein, who's spent a lot of Wall Street dollars in this race. And, that's all going to depend on turnout, really. So these races don't get a lot of attention, but it's just hugely important race. I mean, some races you kind of say, well, is it really going to make a difference in people's lives one way or another? And this is a race.
Talking about the comptroller's race?
Oh, I would never say that. I'm not a
advocate. What are we saying?
President races.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll leave it there.
Got it. Errol.
Yeah. Not only is Mara right, but that Manhattan DA's race is an exception to ranked choice voting. So, one of the things that ranked choice voting does is it eliminates or sort of helps you with the problem of really small pluralities carrying the day. You have, 8 or 9 strong candidates in that race. And so you actually could end up with that somewhat perverse outcome of somebody who, 8 out of 10 voters didn't want, and yet they win. So that for that reason alone, it's worth keeping an eye on. I am curious about the controller's race because the controller does matter. Not so much on a day-to-day basis, but because 6 of the last 7 controllers have then run for mayor, and they occasionally win the nomination, and they occasionally win City Hall. The last time it happened was with Abe Beam, but Harrison Golden ran, and we know John Liu ran, and Bill Thompson ran, and Scott Stringer is running, and on and on and on. So it's a good chance to look at who is going to be on deck. There's also this larger narrative playing out in the controller's race, in some ways more so than in the mayor's race, about the institutional left versus the activist left, where you have groups like the Working Families Party, as well as some of the more left-leaning unions on one side, and then you have the Democratic Socialists of America, and some of the other groups that are out there pushing hard for candidates. And so we'll see what their real strength is citywide. I think you'll be able to tell more from the controller's race in some ways than some of the other races.
All right. Well, Mara, Errol, thanks so much for doing this. It's great to see you. Everyone watching should at least follow them both on Twitter, if nothing else.
And thanks, Ben. It's always fun to see you. Bye,
thanks, Ben.
Bye, Errol.
Hi. I think that our great Congressman Ritchie Torres and our 3 journalists have made it much easier to make a decision about what we want for a mayor in this election on June 23rd. I want to thank them and you for attending this important evening, which will help Citizens Union keep doing what it's been doing for 150 years, bringing good government to New York City.